The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
Over humanity!
The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every
Let us
city.
not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead.
They say that those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. This is the History Lessons Podcast with certified financial planning practitioner Patrick Huey, author of History Lessons for the Modern Investor, and your guide to financial wisdom in the past, present, and future. You ready? Good. Let's get historical.
Historical indeed. This is the History Lessons Podcast, and I'm Patrick Huey, author of History Lessons for the Modern Investor. And in this episode, I'm joined by someone who knows a thing or two about navigating the unpredictable. Ian T. Brown. Commissioned in the U.S. Marine Corps in 2003, Ian earned his wings of gold as a CH-53E Super Stallion helicopter pilot, flying missions from the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan to the wide open expanses of the Pacific. Along the way, he's worn just about every hat the Corps has to offer: air controller, requirement officer, historian, each one giving him a unique vantage on decision-making under pressure. Ian's intellectual flight path is no less impressive. He holds a bachelor's in history from St. Anselm College and a master's in military history from Norwich University. And he's put pen to paper for outlets like the Marine Corps Gazette, War on the Rocks, and Strategy Bridge. And now with his first book, A New Conception of War, Ian delivers a deep dive into the shifting paradigms that have shaped, sometimes upended, the business of modern war. When not writing, he's a war game analyst and host of the Marine Pulse podcast. Now, whether you lead investors, companies, or combat teams, there's something in Ian's journey: adaptability, courage, relentless curiosity that speaks to anyone trying to find clarity in the fog of uncertainty. So buckle up. Today, we'll talk OODA loops, strategic inflection points, and what it really means to lead when the rule book is being rewritten in real time. So let's get started.
Okay.
So the interesting thing to me is I don't want to sound cocky, but I don't often read books where I go, whoa, wait a minute. How did I miss this? But this is one of them. And the reason is twofold. First of all, in college, I did a lot of military history work, had some great professors there, including Donald Goldstein, who wrote, what I think is the preeminent book on Pearl Harbor. I read Jomini, I read Clausewitz, I read Sun Tzu before it was a popular business book and was offered in every airport in America. I'd never heard of John Boyd. And to add insult to injury, I found out through your book that John Boyd is from my hometown of Erie.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. And now I realize, I was doing a lot of flying into Erie International Airport over the last couple of years when my father got sick. I realized that there was a mural in the airport in baggage claim with John Boyd's painting on it.
I've heard about that mural. I've never seen it.
So take me through who this John Boyd guy is and how you became interested in creating a book around his theories.
Sure. Well, first of all, I appreciate the chance to come on and talk about the book and Boyd and Maneuver Warfare. It's become an area of sort of personal passion of mine the last several years. I mean, obviously to the point where I felt compelled to write something about it. But I'll kind of like you, until it really mattered, I guess, I didn't really know anything about John Boyd. And the reason I ultimately wound up sort of doing a book was it was as much as anything else, it was sort of like my own journey on correcting that gap in my knowledge as a military officer, but especially as a Marine officer, because as the book notes, Boyd had a huge impact on the Marine Corps. In terms of who Boyd was, I'll try and give like the 30,000 foot view of this. And I won't dwell too much on specific details because if people want to know more, there's a few biographies already out there about John Boyd, which I can talk about later on if you want. But I would recommend with certain caveats in terms of what you take out of them. But you want Boyd the biography, there's recommendations I can give you. But the short version was he was a um, I sort of call him, an example of like a late Cold Warrior. He was born during the Great Depression, was joined the Army Air Corps at the very end of World War II, but didn't see any action. Although he was stationed in post-war Japan for a couple of years before he got out. He was interested in sort of um, keeping a foot in the military camp in case there was a future conflict. In late 1940s, Cold War is sort of the sides are forming, and it sort of was clear to him that there might be future conflicts coming out of this tension between the communist bloc and Western countries. So he put himself through an Air Force commissioning program, and right before the Korean War kicked off, he was a F-86 Sabre pilot. Went to Korea. This time he got there, while the war was still going. Although based on his experience in flight leadership, he did not get the chance to be, like a flight lead, like the person in charge of a section or more of aircraft, planning and running the mission. But he still flew combat missions. To include in one of his biographies, there's a very interesting kind of hair-raising story about how he and I think it was a British wingman from like the UN coalition that was there. They chased some Soviet fighters to the opposite side of a border they were not necessarily supposed to go after, and then his wingman's radio crapped out, and then his guns crapped out. So they wound up doing this like incommunicado furball of them just trying not to get shot down before they could get back to the other side of the line. So he didn't have a flight leadership position during that war, but he was a good enough pilot that he was actually asked to go and instruct at the Air Force's fighter weapons school, which is every flying service has this like sort of your elite level school for training. Navy's got Top Gun, Air Force's fighter weapons school. And it was his time as an instructor there where he sort of started what would become a lifelong process of like writing ideas down in order to create better mental frameworks for understanding problems. He codified a manual on fighter tactics, which up to that point, like there was no manual. Like it was a lot of, you just sort of, pass down information or instructors saying, don't worry about why this works, just shut up and follow me and do what I tell you. But he wanted to get into the why behind, why does this maneuver work, right? Why does it work under certain configurations against certain enemies, but not under different configurations and enemies? And it was sort of this like, why does this thing work? And understanding the larger context of how to survive in conflict, which is sort of the arc of the rest of his life. There's so much more to talk about, but he had a big that why do things work fed into later design work he did, impacting the F-15 and the F-16 fighter aircraft. It directly impacted into the larger exploration of competition and conflict, which would inform the Marine Corps very heavily come sort of starting in the late 1970s and then going through the 80s into the 90s. And it was something that just sort of it never stopped for him until he died. And once he retired from active duty service, he became sort of a consultant for the Pentagon. But he was also, as he sort of built out these own explorations of his own about competition and conflict, he would share these in the form of briefings with like basically anybody who would listen. He sort of started with one briefing that was very focused on military history, like the why behind why were certain commanders so successful and why were others not. But then he expanded out. He sort of branched off a bunch of spin-off briefings as well to dig more deeply into certain aspects of competition and survival that he would also present to whatever audience. It was these briefings that were sort of his into the Marine Corps. but he briefed him to the different services. He briefed him to academic institutions. There's a video recording of him briefing like the staff in a congressman's office in the 1980s. Just anybody who was interested in like, competition and finding advantages in competition, he would go and talk to them. And the interesting thing about him is like his brain sort of never stopped, right? These briefings were not static creations. He regularly updated them throughout his life. Up until the last year or so before his own death, he was still adding and tweaking because every time he sort of found a new resource or a new book, he would think about it and see, okay, does this work? Does this mesh with my theory? Do I need to adjust my theory? And he would do that. There's like dozens and dozens of different versions of these briefings that he gave. And then he finally passed away, 1997. I think I mentioned it in my book, but sort of a couple of data points about the impact he had, at least on the Marine Corps. One was at his funeral, you had he was not necessarily well liked in the Air Force while he was in, but after he got out of the Air Force and started sort of interacting with Marines, the Marines loved him, and so there were lots of Marines, representing at his funeral, with a much smaller Air Force contingent that was there as well.
I kind of got the feeling just based on the profanity and the attitude that comes through from John Boyd. He was kind of a Marine born in an Air Force officer's body.
Yeah, it's entirely possible. He definitely definitely cursed like a Marine. So he probably found himself right at home there. But one of these couple other data points of like how impactful he was to the Marine Corps, was after he died, there was a note. The commandant at the time that he died in 1997, that was General Charles Krulak, and he said that Boyd had such an influence on the Marine Corps, to include the Marine Corps' success in Desert Storm. It was as if Boyd had commanded like a Marine division himself. That's how impactful his influence was. And then the last data point is the service that wound up holding on to all of Boyd's personal papers, his recordings, some of his personal uniform items. It's not the Air Force. The Marine Corps has all of his personal papers. Yep. In the Marine Corps History Division archives here in Quantico. And if you go to the Marine Corps Museum, his luggage tote bag, with his initials on it, is right there in the museum. It just it was the level of appreciation for his influence. Now we can segue this back to the book. The point is, I knew none of this before I started the process of writing this book, and then as I sort of retrace the thread back to its origins, it was really amazing to me the influences ideas had, and that's what sort of motivated me to. I wanted to share this story back to the Marine Corps because like it's our story in a lot of ways, and there was not a lot of widespread knowledge about his impact because once he passed away in 1997. Most Marines today, like, either weren't born or, they were children, right, when that happened. So there's they just, time has passed, right? But I thought it was a very interesting story, especially at the time I started writing the book, which was sort of the first research was like 2016. But it was an interesting time to me because there were parallels, at least in my mind, in Marine Corps, in Boyd's time, looking at the world around it, seeing a need to adapt and change. And then, 2016, 2017 timeframe, from my perspective, again, Marine Corps is shifting away from a previous conflict it was in, looking at the world around it and identifying a need to change.
Yeah, I mean, I want to briefly back up and talk about another intersection that I had with the history of John Boyd, and then kind of fast forward to what you're talking about in 2016, because I do think, with the benefit of retrospect, you can read a lot of the stuff that he wrote and say, well, yeah, it certainly did play out that way. But you mentioned his Air Force career, and what it was, again, interesting to me is, having gone through flight school in the Navy, having flown tactical aircraft, just how much of that training again, goes back to the things that John Boyd was doing in the 50s and early 60s, with energy states of aircraft and the tactics that were born out of that trickled down into the tactics school, both in the Air Force and the Navy. It really did resonate with me that this guy he was a thinker who was ahead of his time, and he was doing things and creating things that are transformational, not only to our military, but to our history as a country in general. Things like the A-10 Warthog, things like the F-16 and the F-15, that, are generationally the fighters and the attack aircraft that have gotten us through, basically from Vietnam onwards.
Yeah, well, it's you mentioned the aviation piece, especially the energy maneuverability data, and as I sort of was going through my own research in this project, and I came across that, and I had like this holy crap moment where I'm like, the EM theory, EM charts, like I saw those. For your audience, I'm a former Marine CH-53 helicopter pilot. I'm not jets. We don't do fancy aerobatics or anything, but we still have these charts in the
hands less.
Yes. I only have about a 60-degree angle of bank on my hands before bad things start happening. But even in a slow, relatively unmaneuverable helicopter, we still have these charts in our tactical pubs that represent your aircraft's kinetic and potential energy state under different airspeeds, different altitudes, and then how they intersect with the maneuverability and energy states of adversary aircraft under different airspeeds and altitudes. And it's essentially a mathematical proof for like finding those windows where you have advantage, or where your opponent has advantage. And if you have advantage, you want to be in those windows. If your opponent has advantage, you want to not be in those windows with your aircraft. But it's there in a chart, right? Like you can plot where you want to put your aircraft, where it's at the most advantage. And it was something that had never been done before. And that's kind of one of the things that I really I partly drove my interest in Boyd, is like, he's not just a completely conceptual thinker, right? Like it's not all intellectual thought experiments. He produced granular concrete things that impacted the US warfighter in the real world. And actually, like, if I talked about it a little bit in my book, if you read some of his other biographies, it comes out a little bit more, but like almost from his childhood in the Great Depression, like he just had this streak in him where he felt almost like honor bound to produce concrete things that were of use to the people around him, or potentially the future U.S. service members, right? To help them gain that advantage, to help them win and come back home. Yeah.
And then basically what he did, in my mind, is he took that framework for tactical aviation. Where do you want to fight and where do you not want to fight? And after his retirement, he took that to a macro level and started, creating ideas for modern warfare completely separate from aviation, that again still resonate. And you go back to your service, being in country in the mid teens, and looking back at what the Marines had gone through in Iraq, what the Marines had gone through in Afghanistan, and saying, yeah, I mean, he kind of nailed it.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I sort of became a secondary goal for the research in the book was sort of correcting a few of the narratives that are out there about Boyd simply tried to apply one-on-one aircraft tactics into a macro scale, and you can't translate it that. And that's not the case. That's not the case, and I think there's sufficient documented evidence in my book that sort of demonstrates it's not. But so he wasn't trying to translate one-on-one fighter tactics into global lessons on conflict, but it was his again, that trying to understand the why, which from his work in aviation did feed into larger exploration of competition and conflict and gaining advantage therein. And it was, that it was both inquisitiveness and sort of a certain intellectual humility. And it's interesting applying humility to him because in a lot of ways he was not a humble person. But in an intellectual sense, he had enough humility that when he was presented with information that didn't fit into, sort of his expectation, he wouldn't just dismiss that information. He would stop me like, okay, why? Why did that just happen? And that why did that just happen? It really started the manifestation that drove into the conflict ideas that the Marine Corps latched onto. It did start with aviation work that he was doing. It was when he was working on the design of the F-16 fighter aircraft, and it was going through flight tests against the called the YF-17 at the time as a prototype. It became the Navy's F-18 aircraft. He found that his expectation based on the energy maneuverability calculations he had done was that the F-16 would be good in certain areas and not as good in other areas with the F-17 prototype. And they wanted to sort of capture, where were those different performance areas where each did better. But his test pilots came back and sort of said, as one, no, the F-16 is better, like at everything, right? And Boyd was trying to figure out why that was the case, because according to the calculations, that should not have been the case, right? The F-16, it's a smaller aircraft. It's single engine versus dual engine for the F-17, which means, its max airspeed is not as fast, doesn't necessarily carry as much ordnance. But in terms of performance, especially in close-in performance, one-on-one, the F-16 was seen to be superior in almost all regimes by the test pilots. And what came out of
that personally.
Yeah. So, and the reason why, which sort of had not factored into his calculations, was the fly-by-wire flight system in the F-16, which was the first aircraft to use that fly-by-wire. And for your listeners, right, like fly-by-wire, it's what it sounds like, right? There's all old-fashioned aviation, although to include my old aircraft, the CH-53 Echo, which it's being replaced by a fly-by-wire helicopter, but the ones that are still out there, your controls are physically connected to the control surfaces by like pipes and tubes, like long physical linkages that go through the aircraft, so that when you push the stick, it's pushing a tube that pushes the control surface. And even though there's lots of hydraulics and there's electronic assist that helps, that helps the pilot move that, and it helps them move it smoothly. You don't have to like fight against the sheer weight of the thing. There's still, it's not a rapidly responsive system, right? Like you got to put the input in, it translates through all the tubes, and then the control surface moves. What you get with fly-by-wire is, instead of tubes, you have just wires connected to a computer that is moving those control surfaces, and you get much faster response, which means much more agility on that aircraft. And that's really what the F-16 test pilots were noting. It wasn't the F-16 was faster or bigger. It was able to shift in between maneuvers with greater agility than the F-17 could, which was not a fly-by-wire control system. Right. And so that's where Boyd was like, all right, so you're telling me you can have something that is, smaller, slower on paper, but can be a superior performer because of its agility, its ability to basically adapt and input actions and respond to enemy actions more quickly than the enemy. And he took that thread and it stuck with him. And that's where, after he got out of the Air Force, finally, he started being like, okay, this is a possible data point. I would like to go and explore it to see if there is something deeper there, some sort of theory that might get after ways to succeed in competition and conflict. And that's sort of the trajectory that took him into looking at military history.
And from there, we get the theory of maneuver warfare, and we get some pretty cool ways to look at certain situations, including the OODA or the OODA loop. What did you take away when you got very deep into this as far as what maneuver warfare means and how it's been incorporated in the Marine Corps, over the last 25 years?
So it's an interesting question because the deeper I got into it, the more I came to the conclusion that I think there are some out there who sort of equate Boyd's ideas with maneuver warfare, as as a Venn diagram that's a circle, right? Digging into it, I found that was not really the case. The Marine Corps' version of maneuver warfare pulls a lot from Boyd, but it also pulls from Karl von Clausewitz, it pulls from Sun Tzu, it pulls from a few different places. And there's actually in Boyd's sort of hierarchy of conflict, he's got attrition, he's got maneuver, and then he's got something that he sort of calls the moral level of warfare. And what's interesting is like Boyd sort of looked at his maneuver as that was not the ultimate encapsulation of his ideas, right? It was that moral level of conflict. Maneuver, there were definitely advantages, and that's where he talks a lot about maneuver in the physical sense, which I think and as time has gone on, I think there's been some unfortunate. The nomenclature is not helpful for the concept because you hear maneuver, it sort of implies movement in a three-dimensional space of a physical object, when a lot of what Marine Corps maneuver warfare and Boyd's own ideas talks about was things that were happening in like the cognitive domain, right? Which is not a physical three-dimensional space. It's a much more nebulous space where the human brain operates. But the concept, the reason the Marines gravitated and pulled some stuff for Boyd was sort of built on that idea of how do you gain advantage when you don't have the most troops, you don't have the most weapons, you don't have the most funding, all of which described the Marine Corps back in the late 1970s and 80s, still kind of describes the Marine Corps today. It's the smallest of the U.S. armed forces. Mm-hmm. And however, Marine Corps has also traditionally existed sort of as this like first responder entity for the Defense Department and for the United States, right? Like something bad, like whether it's a humanitarian crisis or maybe a deteriorating security situation somewhere where you might have to, evacuate some people or potentially send in your own troops to provide some sort of stability and security, what goes first, right? Well, yeah, the carriers usually go first, but then also the Marines, because they're that forward deployed presence that has a little bit of all types of military power. It's got some logistics, some aviation, some ground combat stuff. It's the first responder to get in there and, stop the bleeding in the short term until the bigger guns, whether it's, Army ground forces or, major Air Force aviation or, the rest of the U.S. Navy, right? You send in an amphibious ready group with a Marine Expeditionary Unit on it. That buys you time, right? Until you can bring in bigger stuff if you need it.
I think it was Reagan who said when the shit hit the fan, his first question was always, "Where are the Marines?"
Yeah, and in historically, at least in the 20th century, that was sort of the Marines' role, right? Like bad stuff's happening, send in the Marines first, and then we'll see if we need to do anything else, or if the Marines can kind of stabilize the situation.
Send the Marines first, ask questions later.
Yeah, but sort of with that, right? If your job is to be that first responder, to be that forward deployed presence for emergencies as they pop up, the expectation is you will win, or you will at least succeed long enough to keep the problem from getting worse until we can bring in heavier forces, right? The expectation is you will succeed. So just because the Marines are the smallest service, they have the least people, they have the least stuff, right? Saying no, sorry, I can't go because I don't have lots of money, I don't have lots of troops, not an option, because that's antithetical to the Marine Corps' mission. And so sort of the new challenge for the Marine Corps, as Boyd was starting to talk about this stuff, new challenge, I mean, not just for the Marine Corps, but for the rest of the services as well, right? They're coming out of Vietnam. They're looking at the world around them here, late 1970s, 1980s. They're seeing a resurgent sort of Soviet Union that's being more aggressive in pushing its weapons out to its not allied states, but its client states, right? The Soviet Union has not been idle during Vietnam. You're seeing them become more aggressive in whether it's other places in Southeast Asia or starting to look to Afghanistan or, making noises in Eastern Europe, right? Soviets have not been idle. So that next conflict after Vietnam could be, either against the Soviet Union or against one of their client states. In most of those cases, Marine Corps is still going to be the David to the Goliath of whoever that is, right? But they're also going to be the first responder to that. They have to be able to succeed. How do they do that if you don't have material advantage? You look for advantage in other realms, and that's where Boyd's idea of cognitive advantage came into play, and the Marine Corps really grabbed onto that because that was something that they could do. Hey, we're never going to get more infantry or more tanks or more Harriers or whatever. But hey, we can adapt and change our minds all day long, right? That doesn't cost a penny in the budget. That just costs focus, effort, training, and thinking about it.
This episode of the History Lessons podcast is sponsored by Victory Independent Planning. Hey, are you ready to take the stress out of your retirement? At Victory Independent Planning, we put you on the right trajectory with our exclusive VIP retirement glide path. Our smart approach prepares you for what's next by optimizing your sources of savings and income, your medical and healthcare planning, your advanced estate and giving strategies, risk management and investing, and tax planning. Let us help you glide into retirement with confidence. Text Glide Path to 239-567-5477. That's Glide Path, all one word, small letter G, to 239-567-5477 and receive a link to schedule a complimentary consultation. Do it today to start your journey on the VIP retirement glide path, because your future deserves a safe landing. Well, and I think it's the right idea at the right time for the right people, because, one of the things that the Marine Corps, I think, has done well over the years is to foster that idea of improvise, adapt, and overcome. It's not just a slogan. It's not just their informal slogan. That they are continually, I thought of the stereotype of the dumb fighter jock, right? And obviously, this guy who created these theories, the EM diagrams, he was not your prototypical dumb fighter jock. And the same thing, I think, carried over to the Marine Corps, right? These are not your typical dumb Marines. These are the guys who are taking a very hard look at, the big picture, the global picture, and trying to figure out where that niche is that they can fit in and excel. And I think that is unique amongst the services. I don't know that, being a Navy guy, I don't know that there are, or there is that idea of improvise, adapt, and overcome all the time, unless we steal it from you guys.
Yeah, well, if we want to go down the Navy route, I think there's actually some historical underpinnings in the Navy that make it sort of more adaptable than traditional land-based forces, because back in the day of the age of sail, right? Like, you go overseas somewhere, you're not talking to anybody. You have whatever orders you were given before you left, and you are left to execute them in the moment as best you can. You don't get to ask anybody else for help because you're over there, they're over, your commanders are way back in the States, and you can't just sit there waiting for orders. You have to adapt. But I think the Marine Corps as a service, maybe it might have gotten some of that from the Navy, but I think it also started having that sort of baked into it, especially in the 20th century. And this is something I talked about a little bit in the book, which was, again, as I look back through the history of it, it struck me how there's the perception of the Marine Corps as always being just like amphibious assault, Iwo Jima, into the teeth of enemy machine guns, last man standing is the winner. That's not an accurate picture of how the Marine Corps was before World War II, or actually was after World War II. The common picture is actually a force that is constantly adapted to new and emerging security threats. and it, in some cases, it adapts when it's ordered to, but in other cases, it has looked ahead, what's coming down the pipe, and started that adaptation before it was required, so that when the call came, they were already adapted and ready.
Yeah.
I trace this back through, like I said, about the 20th century, but if you think about the different roles that the Marine Corps did in the 20th century alone, right? Before World War One, they were sort of the Navy's landing force ashore, but they also did stuff like guard the mail against Pancho Villa, right? And then you go into World War One. Hey, they were asked to be basically another land army, because we just needed bodies to put into the Western Front. So they adapted and became a second land force.
Yeah.
And then after World War One, you get into sort of some of the small wars, or the banana wars, in Central South America. They were everything from a counterinsurgent force to, in some cases, local constabulary to acting as the government. These were not always America's finest hours, to be honest, but at just the missions they were asked to do, they were doing all kinds of stuff that you would think is well outside sort of the standard wheelhouse, but also at the same time, 20s and 30s, what's coming down the pipe, rising Japan, expanding across the Pacific. U.S. is a Pacific power. Pacific powers might clash. So what do we do when that happens? That gets into the whole development of amphibious warfare doctrine, which was done tightly with the Navy, right? That was something both Navy and Marine Corps leaders were thinking about very, very strongly, even if they didn't have the resources to get all the stuff, right? They were thinking about the concepts and the ideas of how you do a naval campaign and then project force ashore to secure lodgements on ground that could then become foundations for future parts of the naval campaign. Navy and Marine Corps were thinking about that very deeply, so that when the balloon goes up World War II, they were ready to execute that type of amphibious warfare in support of the naval campaign in the Pacific. With obviously the Marines didn't really do much in the European theater, because again, they're the smallest service, right? But they wrote the doctrine for it. They wrote the doctrine, and you also had certain Marine Corps leaders, to include Charles Krulak's father, Victor Krulak, who were heavily influential in what became the Higgins boat landing craft, which supported every amphibious operation, Eastern European theater, Pacific theater. I think it was Eisenhower who said something like, "Hey, if we had not had the Higgins boat, we would have had to completely rethink a different way of doing amphibious operations because of what the Higgins boat let us do." And making the Navy take the Higgins boat, which the Navy did not want to do, that was the Marine Corps officer who was just a stubborn little cuss who would not let it go.
I do want to back up, because you mentioned Iwo Jima, and it occurs to me that I need to have a CYA moment here and say that I don't believe in the myth of the dumb fighter jock, and I don't believe in the myth of the dumb Marine either. My grandfather landed on Iwo Jima with the Marine Corps. I've trained with the Marines at Camp Lejeune in forward air control, and I have nothing but respect. So just want to throw that out there and make sure that I'm covering my bases.
Yeah, and hey, while we're talking about it, today is April 1st, which is the anniversary of the first landings in Okinawa. Again, big Navy and Marine Corps effort. And for those in the audience who don't know, I believe it was Okinawa where the Navy actually took some very bad casualties compared to the land campaign, due to because of the kamikaze attacks against the fleet coming from the Japanese home island. So, Navy definitely took a lot of beating in that one to keep the landing force safe so that they could do their job. But yeah, and also I do not agree with the the knuckle dragging infantryman or the frat boy fighter pilot. But again, we're like pre-World War One, Marines did different stuff. World War One's Marine did something different. After World War One, they did something different. After World War Two, this sort of gets into sort of the more modern concept of the Marines as a permanent force in readiness. But once North Koreans were blocking everybody down in the Pusan perimeter, and it looked like we might get kicked off the island. The first responder force there was the first Provisional Marine Brigade, which was like, in some cases, it was literally grabbing people off the streets of Camp Pendleton, telling them you're getting out a boat in 8 days, and just speed was the only thing that mattered. They would sort out who belonged to what unit kind of along the way, but it was getting something there now to stop the bleeding, which is what the first Marine Provisional Brigade did. And then again, you get into land army, right? But then we shift to Vietnam, again, looking at that counterinsurgency, irregular warfare. Coming out of Vietnam, then looking back at resurgent Soviet Union potential for, again, maybe more large-scale conventional ground combat operations. But how does the Marine Corps fit into that? But it just, even in the space of less than 100 years, Marine Corps is an organization that either adapted quickly when it was told to, or it looked ahead what was coming down the pipe and got itself ready for when the moment came when they might have to do something.
You could say, and I'm going to, you could say that history of the Corps, really does mirror one continuous OODA loop, OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and take action. And again, that's where I think the man and his, in John Boyd, the man and his ideas meet the organization, and it's, it's how history is made.
Yeah, I mean, you could make the argument that the Marine Corps was good at that, especially that orientation step of the OODA loop, which is sort of the engine that drives the whole thing. But it's the whole point of orientation is it's not just speed of reaction to an unfolding situation, but it is contextualizing, it is understanding, it is applying all of the different inputs of knowledge and experience that you have had from all the different subordinate components of your organization over time, all of those coming together in that moment, and then doing analysis in that moment for what is necessary.
So a lot of what maneuver warfare talks about from a doctrinal perspective is, and I think a lot of this was learned from Vietnam, but you can go way back in history and look at other examples, but really focusing not just on, movement or material for movement and material's sake, but how it actually affects, the enemy's psyche. And I know based on the intro to your book that, like me, you've been to Yorktown, you've been to Gettysburg as a young man. For me, Gettysburg was foundational to becoming kind of an armchair historian. And I've told that story previously on the show, but real quickly, if you go to the Gettysburg battlefield, the largest monument on the field is the Pennsylvania Monument. All the money came from locally. And as you tour around it, all the names of the generals are around the cupola of that monument, and you get up to the interior, and the name Huey shows up about 3 or 4 rows down. I had no idea who this dude was, but like you, it created an itch that I had to scratch and go and do the research and find out. So that, as I was thinking about maneuver warfare and actually how people react to things, I started thinking about the Civil War, and I started thinking about Lee's campaign, throughout Virginia, specifically Chancellorsville, where, the federal troops outnumbered, outmanned, provisioned, they out everythinged Lee's forces, but he was so in their head that they couldn't accept that they had an advantage. And to me, that's the kind of thing that John Boyd absolutely would have loved. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In Boyd's presentations, he actually he mentions the Civil War, but he doesn't actually go into a lot of detail about it, which is sort of a curious thing for an American, military person to leap over that.
Especially since, and I know this, he went to a high school named after Colonel Strong Vincent, who is very famous in Gettysburg.
Oh yeah, Little Round Top. I've been up there and I've made my kids climb that many times. But yeah, so, and it's hard. It's difficult to sort of distill maneuver warfare down to just one thing, because it is supposed to sort of have its fingers in all aspects of, how your military organization is structured. But there are some things you can sort of point to as examples of the outputs of looking at the cognitive domain, which is sort of where maneuver warfare is intended to operate, as opposed to just the physical domain. And it's definitely it's psychological and mental, emotional impacts. And you look at Chancellorsville, like, that battle was not lost due to attrition or due to who had more troops on the battlefield, right? It was lost because of mental shock on one or two key people who could then not adapt, not cope with the rapidly changing, deteriorating situation around them. And as it happens, those words that I just used are I've sort of pulled them from the Marine Corps Maneuver Warfare doctrinal publication, Warfighting. But it talks about how maneuver warfare it's presenting your opponent with these rapidly multiple thrusts that the opponent doesn't necessarily see the order or the linkage behind the movements, but it presents multiple rapid deteriorating situations, and the opponent just cannot adapt and overcome them compared to your own tempo against them. Chancellorsville definitely a great example of that. But sort of another way of measuring the output, and this was given to me, I didn't come up with this, but a former Marine, sort of fellow traveler in military theory and maneuver warfare of mine by the name of Dan Grazier. He's I believe he's a former Marine. I think he was an artilleryman. I may have to double back on that. But he had done some of his own writing and research on maneuver warfare and published a few articles about it. But he had this presentation that he's got, and it's on YouTube. I think in my book, I think the YouTube link is actually in the book, okay, where he kind of brought home, like, what's the difference between a maneuver output and an attrition output? And he said it's the difference between body count and prisoners. Yeah. He notes that his argument that the attrition mindset, and there's a whole separate conversation we could have about the attrition versus maneuver dichotomy, sort of a false dichotomy that Boyd certainly never believed in. However, it sort of characterized some of the debate in the 1980s about maneuver warfare. And at the end of it, maneuver kind of won, right, quote unquote. But a lot of the maneuverist folks were like, that was really not the best way of framing the argument, because it's not one or the other.
Right.
But anyway, Dan's point was like, the more materially focused approach to warfare is destruction of body counts, right? How many tanks did I destroy? How many enemy did I kill? And it's not looking at
in Vietnam that did not particularly matter.
Yeah, exactly. Like that, absent any other context, those numbers, you can bomb and kill and do all kinds of stuff to an opponent, and they will not quit if they still think in their minds that there is some chance they have a resistance or winning, right? And Vietnam was a great example where we, what was the body count? Well, we killed 20 Viet Cong, and they dragged the rest into the woods, so we killed a bunch more, right? To bump those numbers up, and it didn't matter. We bombed the bejesus out of the north, and it didn't matter. We killed God knows how many Vietnamese. Yep. And it didn't matter, because that was not the thing that was important to them. Their center of gravity was something, something mental, something built into, ejecting the invader, right? Something as fundamental as that. And you can trace it further back into Vietnam, right? Like World War II, all sides tried to kill their way into ending the war more quickly, because they thought if they just killed us, bomb the crap out of everybody, they will quit. Wrong. We bombed the crap out of Germany and still had to fight into their capital to do it. Germany tried to bomb the crap out of Britain, didn't work. Germany destroyed and killed so much of Eastern European countries and Soviet Union. It didn't work. We bombed, burned, incinerated large parts of the Japanese home island, and it didn't work because there was still the idea that there was resistance that could be had.
Yep.
Whereas if you look at instances where you bag a lot of prisoners on the battlefield, that's where the resistance that matters, the mental resistance that I still have some way of fighting back, that has collapsed internally. And then the numbers on the battlefield are less relevant than putting the opponent in that mindset of further resistance is futile. And so some of Dan's examples were, but looking both at like World War I, World War II, collapses of a lot of the Russian armies, right? Where guys like Russians manpower was always, in fact, Boyd mentions this in one of his briefings that he's sort of talking about World War II. What advantages did different countries bring to the table? And he's not terribly charitable in some of these characterizations, but like he was like, the Russian strength is manpower, right? They just have people that they can throw at the problem. But all those people, again, both World War I, World War II, at least in the beginning phases, didn't matter because those soldiers collectively determined that they could not effectively resist, and so they surrendered. And so you had, both the Kaiser's armies and then the Third Reich's armies bagging tens of thousands of prisoners who still had the physical means to resist, but they were convinced by everything they were seeing around them that it was not possible to resist further. And you saw the same thing in France, World War II, where again, it's, I think more people understand this now that, the French actually had pretty good tanks. They were at least materially and manpower equal, if not superior, to the German Wehrmacht in some respects. But it was because the Germans were able to slice and cut and degrade command and control, move their forces in a more agile fashion, and make it look like they were, bigger, more numerous, and faster than they necessarily were. That picture convinced, the French command and the French government that they could not resist.
Well, and
one of the
things that really jumped out at me and looking at that history, and I'm actually reading a book about the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, where they basically ran the same game plan and that they would in World War I and World War II. What was interesting to me is just, I think that Boyd is again ahead of his time, because now when you create a world that is so interconnected, it becomes much, I won't say easier, but much more, you have more capability to affect psychological operations, I think, and degrade an enemy in that manner than you did 20, 30, 40 years ago. And he died before the internet was a thing. So to me, that really jumped out as, modern warfare, psychological operations, maneuver warfare, it all integrates together.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that because, for one, that's kind of an argument I'm making in my second Boyd book, which hopefully is going to come out this year, which is going to be a full compilation of transcripts of all of his briefings, so that a wider audience can actually read what he said in his own words. Like you can't hear it. Although if you really want to listen to the recordings, you can, but man, they are painful, which is why I wanted to transcribe it so other people didn't have to suffer through that. But it tells you in Boyd's own words what he was thinking. And I think that the most interesting, to me, the most interesting and the strongest parts of his theories were not necessarily the ones that the Marine Corps took. They were those things that talked about the moral level of conflict. And it's, as you said, like, I mentioned it in my book that Boyd was sort of like a YouTube personality in an analog age. But he constantly talks about the use of narrative, right? Of strategic narrative, of messaging, of not just like murdering your way to victory, but of using other levers of power, such as, I'm your friend, right? Or we're stronger together, or we're allies and partners, whatever we call it. But using non-kinetic avenues to improve the strength of your position, undermine the strength of your opponent, and that's his moral level of conflict. That's the ultimate level of conflict and competition for him is essentially like building this positive worldview and world organization for yourself. It gives you the advantage of having lots of friends and people on your side, and taking those away from your possible competitor, isolating your competitors. Because it's something he talks about, and it's interesting if when my second book comes out and you get the full transcript of Patterns of Conflict instead of just the excerpts that I have in the current book that you've got. He talks about how a lot of sort of theory and approaches to conflict and warfare, they're very negative, right? They're destructive, right? Like kill people and break stuff. Um, but that's not how you how you build, how you build a world after the war is over, where you don't have to fight that war again. Is sort of the point he's getting at.
Yep.
And to do that, it requires a positive perspective. It's not just murdering and destroying, but it is what can I do if you work with me? What can I do that will make you better, make me better, rather than us, being competing with each other? Why don't we work together for our own various interests and advantages, but it'll make both of us better together. And then if you still have adversaries or competitors out there, every entity that you bring to your side with that perspective takes it away from your adversary. It in the Sun Tzu sort of approach, it weakens your adversary without fighting. If you approach that cognitive level of competition, and so when we look around today, I've done a couple of other presentations to some military entities, kind of looking especially in the context of war in Ukraine right now. And it was interesting because I did a couple of briefings on Boyd to the Swedish Defense University several years back. The first one I did predated the war in Ukraine, and I was looking at the Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where they started leveraging social media to show basically war footage of, hey, my drones are destroying your tanks and destroying your trenches, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so it's those were different avenues for not just the kinetic impact on the battlefield, but showing that picture of you can't resist, right? That using your social media footage, not only can I kill you, I am showing you and all of your friends not near the battlefield, you can't stop me. Yeah. That's an incredibly demoralizing, undermining thing to be able to do. And then we fast forward a couple of years into the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I gave the same brief to the same audience at Swedish Defense University. But I was like, hey, I thought Nagorno-Karabakh was sort of like the capstone of Boyd in 21st century warfare, looking at the use of strategic messaging avenues to undermine your adversary. No, I was wrong. We are seeing it here right now. Yeah. And what I wrote in the introduction of my of the second book that's going to come out is, I think Boyd would entirely understand. I use a couple of different examples, including Gaza, the war in Gaza, but looking at how the use of narrative and messaging and those digital tools like social media, they have had real material benefits for Ukraine in terms of getting material support from other entities that they themselves don't have, in a way that Boyd would fully understand, and using those digital platforms as messaging tools, both to undermine the adversary, right? Like, yep. There's nothing as demoralizing as watching like a drone kill cam of hitting a bunch of troops in the open or tanks in the open, and just watching them get destroyed, at the tactical level. But then going to the strategic and that tactical level, that's that destructive, right? Breaking stuff and killing things. But then taking those same platforms up to the strategic level of showing and demonstrating resistance, and right, like you give us the tools to help us resist. Boom, here's the kill cam footage of us putting your tools to use and having an effect against the enemy. Give us more tools and we can do kind of more of that stuff. So I think, yeah, to your point, I think Boyd was already talking and thinking about that stuff. The tools to do it just didn't exist. 1997, I was on dial-up internet, right? There was no the digital saturation of the world, which simply did not exist back then, right? But he was thinking his thinking and his ideas with the tools that exist now. I think they're entirely in line with each other, and I think he would fully understand things we're seeing today on current battlefields. My light back on here.
Good segue, I think. Tell us a little bit about your experience, because we talked offline. We've done a show with an author who wrote about her research into the attack on Camp Bastion in Afghanistan. Understand that you were there. Tell us a little bit about your career, things you've seen, and if you want to throw some maneuver warfare examples in there, then feel free.
Yeah, so I'll actually try and do that because in my last few years in uniform, when I was more involved in professional military education, I had some really interesting discussions with some other sort of fellow travelers, of people who believed in PME and believed in professional development, and we would sort of compare and contrast, like, we were in different parts of the Marine Corps. Was the Marine Corps a maneuver warfare organization or not? Mm-hmm. And the different perspectives we have are actually really interesting. I'll try and get there, but yeah, for myself, like I said, I'm a retired CH-53 Echo helicopter pilot. I was commissioned 2003. So I sort of had an idea of going into the Marine Corps before 9/11, but then 9/11 happened, and that was a real catalyst, like I think it was for a lot of folks during that time. I was not the kind of person like who grew up like, I've got to fly. I need to, be up there in the clouds with everybody. It was more, I talked to the OSO, the selection officer, and I just had a very nebulous idea of I want to join the military. The Marines were the first ones my freshman year in the cafeteria handing out stuff. So I talked to them first. And they're like, yeah, hey, interested in, oh, by the way, do you have, do you have 20/20 vision? Oh, you do? Great. Have you thought about like an aviation contract? I said, no, I haven't. Well, they said, you should take like the entry test, right? It tests your aerospatial understanding of like, am I turning left, turning right? So just take it. And like, if you pass it, great. You've got the option to do an air contract. If you don't pass it, lots of other things we can do with you in the Marine Corps. So I took it and I passed. And then I forget when I committed to the aviation contract. It might've been after my first stint at OCS, but I eventually came to be like, I could walk and crawl through the mud here, or I could fly, and make the helicopter carry all the heavy stuff instead of putting it on my back.
It's kind of a brainer when you get to that point.
Yeah. So I went with the aviation contract. It's interesting. You went through flight school, right? I know, jets are often at the top of people's picks for flight school. I didn't have a huge urge to necessarily go jets myself, partly because I found out in primary flight training during aerobatics, my body did not really like pulling lots of G's and yanking and banking. But having gone through the basic school and then into flight school, I liked the idea of doing something that was close to the Marines on the ground, right? I didn't want to walk and carry a heavy pack, right? But I liked supporting the guys who did that. Yeah. So I started looking at assault support aviation, and for the audience who may not know, like, assault support is the category of we're moving stuff and people from point A to point B. And there's lots of different missions inside that you can do that are all really interesting, but it's every time you do an assault support mission, if you've got Marines in the back, like, you're seeing directly your impact on the Marine ground forces, which ultimately, the bumper sticker for Marine aviation is that it's there for the guys on the ground, right? The Marine aviation is not a self-licking ice cream cone, to just go out there and have fun by themselves. It is always in support of Marines on the ground. Yep. And assault support is about as close as you can get. Like, you put the Marines on the ground, right? That's about as close as you can get in terms of supporting them. So I think I put the CH-53 Echo top of my list. I think we still had the CH-46, the Frogs, back then when I was in. So I think that was like second on my list because that was another troop carrier. But I went through the fleet replacement squadron. Went out to my first squadron was HMH 462 out on the West Coast, out of Miramar, San Diego. I was with them for about 8 months until myself and a bunch of other pilots got sent over to HMH 361, the Flying Tigers, to plus up their roster to go over to Iraq. And I wound up going back to 361 every time after I came off of a ground tour. So I did 2 deployments of 361 to Iraq in First was '07 to '08, and then 2009. Then I got selected to go on a forward air controller tour with First Battalion's year. And I think you said you were a former TACP, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, we went to TACP school out there in
And I'm smiling
Coronado.
because I love that mission. I like you, I really enjoyed the ability to help out the guys on the ground and do what we could for them wherever they were.
Yeah, I mean, if you came from TAC Air, you probably had some familiarity with, employment of air to ground munitions. I had none, beyond the 50 cal that was hanging off of the helicopter, which we never fired that on my first two deployments. But it was a really interesting mission. It was all brand new information, so it was it was definitely a challenge, but it was also really interesting to like kind of do the geometries and the math problems of setting up your attacks, your final attack approaches for the aircraft that were coming in to support you. And again, as a forward air controller with the Marine Corps Infantry Battalion, like that, you are tied in to everything that they are doing. They walk somewhere, you walk with them now instead of flying. You act as a aviation advisor to the battalion commander for how requesting the proper assets or planning out missions that require integration with the aviation combat element. We went out. Interesting on that tour. I had a highly unique experience among other Marine forward air controllers, which was I spent about 9 months as the headquarters and service company commander for 17, which typically company command goes to infantry guys, even the HNS company. But they were short on captains. I came in, hey, I was a Marine Corps captain. I should be able to do Marine Corps captain things, was the battalion commander's expectation. And I think he knew that I didn't really know what I was doing in doing that, but he was like, you're a Marine Corps captain. And I had an absolutely fantastic support staff for HNS in both my XO, he was a Marine grunt first lieutenant. He knew all the grunt stuff, so I didn't have to worry about, planning that specific things. But I had a fantastic company first sergeant and company gunnery sergeant who they knew what needed to be done. They just kind of needed me to be there to blast off on what they were doing. And it was a really, really, it was a fantastic experience. And then went out on the 31st. I did not get to take the company on the 31st MEU, which I was a little bummed about because HNS's mission on the MEU was non-combatant evacuation operation. That's the company that sets up like the reception centers, like the processing. They're the ones who do NEO. And on a Marine Expeditionary Unit, there was always a non-zero chance that you might do NEO as one of your humanitarian relief things. But they got another Marine infantry captain who took over the company before we left, and so I didn't get to do that. I just got to do forward air controller stuff on the MEU, which was still great. But as it happened, my former squadron 361 provided the 53s on the MEU deck for that same 31st MEU. So I was still out there with some of my former flying comrades. And when we came off the boat in the last month on Okinawa, they got me some flight time out of Futenma. And then sort of using that, I was able to get back to 361 after my FAC tour. It was a third deployment, fourth deployment. I went with 361 to Afghanistan, 2012, 2013. That's when I was there, or our squadron was there for the attack on Camp Bastion. That was like a week after I got into there. The squadron had left a month before me. I stayed behind because my wife's father died 2 days before we deployed. And so they let me stay behind to help her deal with that. But then, I got to Afghanistan in September, and 1 week later, boom, Camp Bastion's on fire. Wow. And then I left. I went to Marine Corps Combat Development Integration, which is sort of the big building that controls requirements for equipment and budgets for equipment. I was there as the requirements officer for TACP gear, which was great. So I actually knew what was in my portfolio. I knew the things that were in my portfolio of equipment, which is not always the case for people in that building. And then left there, went back to 361 again to do a unit deployment program out to Okinawa in 2018. And then my last stint in uniform was, 2016, during this is when I started doing my master's program, which fed into the book. So came out of CD&I. I think the book had just been gone under contract to the Marine Corps University Press. And then while I was on that deployment to Okinawa, I was getting the printer proofs like sent to me from the press. And I'm sitting there in my freezing cold office because the AC in Okinawa is insane, reading through the printer proofs while we were out there on deployment. And then about a month after I left my squadron to go to my last tour, the book came out. And so my final tour was at Marine Corps University at the Brew Krulak Center for Innovation in Future Warfare. Same Brew Krulak who is behind the Higgins boat.
Yeah.
There's actually a small bronze cast of a Higgins boat that was a gift to him from Andrew Higgins that we had in the office at the Krulak Center, which is really cool. And there's about the same time the book got published. No, it was about a year after the book got published, but it was shortly after I got there, 2019, that it was added to the Commandant's professional reading program, which was beyond my wildest dreams. Like I wrote the book because I was Marine Corps University Press made the offer, and I was like, sure, I'll write a book for you. I've never done it, but how hard could it be?
No problem.
Turns out it was hard.
Yeah.
I wrote the book to fill in, like I said, fill in that gap in my own knowledge of my own, like, this is the Marine Corps story, right? Of how Boyd and not just about Boyd, but like how the Marine Corps was an adaptive organization and how it came to this warfighting concept, which is still its warfighting concept today.
Yep.
I knew almost none of this. I was going to fix myself by writing the book, and then hopefully the book would be useful to retell that story to a new generation. Because, like I said, about the same time, Marine Corps coming out of Afghanistan, Iraq was in the rearview mirror. We were coming out of Afghanistan. What was going on in the world around us, right? You have a resurgent People's Republic of China that's looking pretty aggressive against its neighbors. The Marine Corps was going to, that's a maritime fight. That is a land and naval campaign in the great tradition of the Navy and Marine Corps. It was going to take both of them to do it. How is the Marine Corps going to tackle that problem? And as it happened, the Marine Corps was looking at how to tackle that. 2019, when I got to Marine Corps University, looking at the force design change process. And so in the context of my book was like, we've changed before, right? To look at an emerging threat. We are doing it again today. Maybe this book can serve as an example of this is how we did it in the past, right? Not the first time we've changed and adapted, but this is how we did it in the past. Might be good to revisit that story in the now as we go through that process again.
Well, I mean, it's solid history. It's well written. I mowed through about 120 pages, in 48 hours, not because I had to, but because I just got into it. So, I don't think for an author there's any better compliment than that.
Oh yeah, you willingly read my book. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yes. So, what are you working on now?
So I mentioned second Boyd book, which is several years later than I wanted it to be. But as I mentioned in the introduction to the second book, I think it actually makes the book more relevant, frankly, because if I'd released it on time, it would have been before the invasion of Ukraine, before the war in Gaza, where a lot of the informational messaging narrative stuff has been such a huge part of both of those conflicts. I hate the fact that both happened, but they did. But I think Boyd's his vision, his insights looking forward into exactly those types of conflicts. I think it makes what he says in the book now more relevant when we have those two sort of laboratories to look at them through. But that book is going to be verbatim transcripts of patterns of conflict, organic design for command and control, the strategic game, and the conceptual spiral. It's going to be, I want it to be as close to like the full Boyd as we can possibly get without resurrecting him out of his grave and standing him in front of us. Beyond that, I have not talked about what my actual day job is, which is as a war game analyst. So I have a few game designs in the pipeline, one of which is called Maneuver Warfare. It's a deck construction game like Magic the Gathering. Sometimes I call it like Marines the Gathering. for those who are interested. But it's a deck construction game where I've tried to take aspects of maneuver warfare doctrine and like make it a physical thing that you can do. And I have there's like a red side and a blue side. The blue side looks very much like the Marine Corps with some Navy stuff thrown in. The red side is sort of a hybrid of Russia, China, and terrorist organizations. But there's been sort of a resurgence in wargaming across the DoD, but especially in the Marine Corps as a professional military educational tool, right? It's another training tool where the best thing is going out into the field to do tough, realistic training. Next best thing before that is either like go to the range or go to the simulator to do it. But you're not always going to have time and opportunity to even do those things.
Right.
How can you maintain your cognitive, your professional development edge when you don't get to go to the range or you don't get to go to the field? I think wargaming is a fantastic avenue for doing that because it still puts you into a dynamic, unpredictable environment. It forces you to make decisions, adapt your decisions to what your thinking opponent does on the other side. It is a very low resource commitment. Like my card game costs $30, right? That's a bargain compared to going to the range for whatever that costs. And it's a safe to fail space in wargaming because, all right, if you lose, your ego gets hurt, and you've hopefully learned some lessons that you can apply the next time. You're not sacrificing blood or treasure. The cost of your failure in wargaming is not blood or treasure. And I think you want to get those failures out of your system, just like if you were, Navy going to Top Gun, right? You want to lose those dogfights in a controlled environment where you actually get to go home at the end of the day. Wargaming is the same thing. You get to lose, you get to learn from your failures, and you do it before failure really costs you.
Well, and I think especially with maneuver warfare and OODA loops and trying to keep ahead of your opponent, all you're really trying to do is teach people to think, right? And think at a rate that is marginally faster than the opponent. And if you can do that and you can keep that edge sharp, that's the advantage you carry in.
Yeah, and I look back, I compare our situation today to situation of the Marine Corps, late Cold War against the resurgent Soviet Union. You look at what the PRC, for example, is putting on the table in terms of manpower, equipment, munitions. The numbers are not in our favor. So where do we still look for places where we can gain advantage? And I think that the cognitive domain is still a place where we can gain a significant advantage. And wargaming is just like going to the range for your brain. It's a way of exercising, developing those good habit patterns in the cognitive domain so that when you're called to do it for real, your brain is already queued up to think and adapt faster and better than your adversary.
All right. We're at an hour and 15. I think we could probably go on for another 3 hours, just
probably
based on the conversation. But Ian Brown, the book is A New Conception of War, John Boyd, the U.S. Marines and Maneuver Warfare. You want to tell us where we can get it?
Yeah, if you Marine Corps University Press, they are still making print copies as far as I know. If you go to the University Press's website, you can get the PDF for free. It's a non-for-profit government printing agency, so your taxpayer dollars have already paid for it. You may as well take advantage of it. Or if you email the press directly at mcu_press@usmcu.edu, they'll mail you a hard copy as well.
Cool. We'll link all that in the show notes. And thanks for coming on, man. It was a fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Cheers. Wow. After all that, here are just 4 lessons for the modern investor, and there could be 400, courtesy of Ian Brown, John Boyd, and the book, A New Conception of War. If investing sometimes feels like waging war, you're not wrong. Both operate under the shadow of uncertainty, propelled by the need to make sound decisions under shifting, often treacherous conditions. And few people understood this better than John Boyd, that Air Force maverick who, with a slide deck and relentless intellect, transformed the way the U.S. military conceived of conflict. In the fog of markets, strategy is survival. So here's lesson 1, the OODA loop. decision-making as a tactical advantage. John Boyd didn't win his aerial duels in Korea because he had a better aircraft. Very often, he didn't. He won because his mind cycled through the observe, orient, decide, act loop faster than his opponents. In essence, he could get inside their decision timeline, rendering their plans obsolete before they even unfolded. In a new conception of war, this principle exploded traditional notions of warfare as a set-piece slog. Instead, the shrewd commander and the smart investor thrives by reading signals early and never growing overly attached to yesterday's tactics. In investing, the OODA loop is about feedback and flexibility. Too many investors fall prey to analysis paralysis in pursuit of perfect information. But as Boyd and modern market history both show, perfect information is a myth. The world moves on while you hesitate, waiting for clarity. Say that 10th analyst report or the next interest rate announcement. Often that means you're reacting to a reality that's already passed. Markets like battlefields reward the thoughtful. So make your decisions, learn quickly, and never bet your survival on outdated information. Lesson 2, the Maginot Line fallacy, why static defenses fail. France's Maginot Line was a marvel of engineering, thick stone, deep bunkers, and all guns aimed at Germany's last avenue of advance. When the next war came, the Germans simply bypassed it, slicing through the Ardennes and rendering years of planning irrelevant in just weeks. Every portfolio loaded with last year's winners, every strategy that assumes safety is static, is a Maginot Line in the making. And Boyd would have hated it. We fall into the trap of thinking capital preservation is about building impenetrable walls, perhaps a fortress of blue chip stocks, a bunker of bonds, a seawall of index funds. Yet time and again, tech stocks in 2000, financials in 08, even the supposedly stalwart energy giants in 2014, those static defenses turn out to be very, very brittle. Boyd and a new conception of war's doctrine is clear. Defense must be dynamic, not static. Adaptation trumps fortification. Successful investors diversify, not just across sectors, but across regimes of risk, accounting for shifts in policy, innovation, and even the psychology of the crowd. If all of your defenses are pointed in the same direction, you won't see the blitz coming from the flank. So don't confuse what protected you yesterday with what will save your tomorrow. Markets reinvent themselves with gleeful disregard for your comfort zone. Lesson 3, patterns of conflict. Learning, unlearning, relearning. For John Boyd, war was less a calculus of force and more a contest of adaptation. As he famously quipped, you've got to challenge all assumptions. His magnum opus, Patterns of Conflict, tracks how successful commanders, and by extension, successful companies and investors, win by constantly learning and reinterpreting the environment. What works in one area is a death sentence in the next. Visit any bear market, any financial crisis, and you'll meet the ghosts of those who fought the last war. The lesson isn't to time every shift perfectly, but to remain a lifelong student of change, willing to test, fail, recalibrate, and start anew. Too many investors fall back on mean reversion, assuming history's patterns will repeat exactly because it's the comfortable story. As Boyd insisted, the real winners repeatedly unlearn the stale habits and find pattern in chaos. The greatest risk is intellectual stasis. So challenge your models before the market does it for you. Finally, lesson 4, the perils of dogma. Best practices are not a survival plan. John Boyd's true genius was his war against institutional dogma. Rather than blindly accepting the way things are done, he questioned every convention, every so-called best practice, and every comfortable myth upheld by bureaucracy. His efforts earned him as many enemies as admirers, but he was proven right. Stagnation is fatal, especially to those who think themselves too established to fall. Markets love consensus until they turn on it. The echo chamber effect, amplified by social media and 24/7 news, means best practices proliferate and decay with dizzying speed. The cults of FANG stocks in the 2010s, the gospel of passive everything in the 2020s, these beliefs all became their own greatest hazards when left unchallenged. As Boyd might say, he who relies on doctrine over critical thinking relies on a shield made of paper. The lesson is not to abandon wisdom, but to recognize its sell-by date. Success in investing is built on willingness to discard what no longer fits the environment, to experiment at the edges, and to build resilience amid uncertainty. Don't worship best practices. Outgrow them. The real best practice is relentless adaptation. Okay, final thought here. John Boyd changed the art of war. His legacy is a clarion call for all thinkers willing to unshackle themselves from convention, whether in air combat or asset allocation. Survival and success belong to those who move, think, and adapt ahead of the curve. As you step into the fray, remember, the best strategy is not to predict the future. It's to become uncommonly good and thriving in whatever future unfolds. Well, my fellow historians, that's all for this episode, but be sure to check out Ian's book, A New Conception of War. I'm linking to it in the show notes, and you can actually get a free copy of it in a PDF format from USMC University. And while you're surfing the web, check me out on Amazon. That's where my book is, History Lessons for the Modern Investor, or text BOOK to 239-567-5477, and I'll just send you a copy. And be sure to do all the social stuff with us, like this episode, and follow us wherever you're seeing or hearing this podcast. We're available on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Until next time, when we'll take another rollicking romp through the past and make an investment in your future with History Lessons for the Modern Investor.